Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Snare Drum Virtuoso podcast. My name is Jonathan Curtis and today I'm going to be discussing and exploring some seminal works on the snare drum that include both pedagogical works, method books and compositional works as well. These are works that I think are defining in some manner, have had enormous effects on me as a practitioner, a student of the art form, and I feel have had great effects on the drumming community at large as well. So I'm going to be exploring a collection of those today in the hope that more people may be exposed to them or be encouraged to explore them, as I feel anybody who is somewhat serious and sincere about increasing and improving their ability and knowledge and understanding on the snare drum would greatly benefit from having a working understanding of these books. Now, as we were beginning there in the introduction, we were hearing a short excerpt from a piece entitled The Highland Sling. This is one of my duet pieces from a collection of works called Contemporary Marches for Snare Drum. Obviously, it's a duet between the snare drum and the bass drum, and it's a nice piece because it's written in a cross between the American rudimental and the Scottish pipe drumming styles, and I think there's a nice crossover there. So it was a fun one to write and a fun one to play. Now, before we go any further, we're going to listen to another piece in my quest to keep exposing everybody to the snare drumming repertoire. This is a very famous piece. This is one of Charlie Wilcoxon's most famous pieces. This is called Rolling in Rhythm, and this is a piece I was first exposed to many years ago, 25 years ago. And I found a small, obscure, odd-looking book in a local drum shop called Modern Rudimental Swing Solos. And I'd never heard of it before. I'd never heard of the author, and I'd never seen any of the pieces inside it before. So on a whim, I decided to buy it. And on that fateful day, my love affair with rudimental drumming and the snare drum in particular began. Not that I knew it back then, but that would be something of a pivotal moment in my career and drumming life. So before we go any further, let's explore, listen to, and enjoy Charlie Wilcoxon's Rolling in Rhythm. Wonderful, very famous piece, and one that's always good fun to play. Now, as always, if you like the things you hear in these podcasts, you are more than welcome to visit me at my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk. I have a wealth of publications, educational material, compositions and performances. I offer lessons, both in person and online, to students all over the world. And I have an array of educational, pedagogical and performance-based videos on my YouTube channel as well, /JCurtisDrums. So pop across there and say hello if you'd like to explore more of this material. So let's get started. I'm going to begin with a book that is perhaps the most important in terms of my own musical journey. I don't exaggerate when I say that this book perhaps single-handedly changed my thought process and approach more than any other I have ever experienced, and at least in terms of drumming and music and careers. And that book is Rudimental Arithmetic by Bob Becker. Now, last time I talked about Bob Becker as being a paragon of mastery on this instrument, and Rudimental Arithmetic is, I think, his masterpiece in terms of pedagogy. He has produced some absolutely seminal compositions, Lahara and Mudra come to mind, but Rudimental Arithmetic represents the culmination of a conceptual and analytical approach that I think he has explored over his career, over his lifetime, and puts these ideas down in such an accessible and logical manner that when I discovered it and read it, it was almost literally mind-blowing. It really, I was ready for it, I think, when I encountered it, and it really changed my approach like nothing else. I encountered this only relatively recently, probably in the past 4 or 5 years. And I encountered it because just as COVID happened, just before or just as the first wave of COVID infections began and the world was starting to grind to a halt, I was very fortunate in that I received an Arts Council England funding grant to conduct some research into the snare drum as a solo instrument. And the goal was to explore compositional concepts and then produce some compositional works off the back of that research. And I was very fortunate to get a substantial funding grant to fund that work. And throughout the course of that research, I did a lot of interviews and I had consultation sessions and lessons and everything I could find. And I really can't remember who it was now, but somebody turned me on to Bob Becker and said, explore a book called Rudimental Arithmetic. And I'd never heard of it before, and I was only passingly familiar with Becker at the time. And I did just that. I contacted Bob, and he was gracious enough to talk to me and exchange email conversations with me and answer my questions and answer interview questions and all sorts of things. And I also bought myself a copy of Rudimental Arithmetic. And all of this happened in this period of really intense and focused study on my part. So I was already in this mindset of devouring these compositional, theoretical, conceptual ideas. And Bob and his book came along just at the right time for me. So the whole idea behind Rudimental Arithmetic is it does a couple of things. It first of all presents a conceptual analysis of rudimental ideas. So this was for me one of the first times I had encountered this approach where a paradiddle was not just a paradiddle, but it was a single instance or an example of a much broader concept or approach, a sticking idea, a sticking concept. I'd never really encountered that in any formal way before. So to see I think he breaks it down into paradiddles and then flams and drags, drag-based figures, and measured rolls. They're the big three before he goes on to tackle all sorts of fascinating concepts like the partitions of numbers and values and roll densities and compositional ideas that were really fascinating. A lot of them are, of course, based on mathematics and numbers, as the title would suggest. But more than that, it's a conceptual analysis of the rudimental ideas. So what is a paradiddle? As I've said, it's presented as just a single instance of a much broader concept. So what does this concept represent? What is the paradiddle concept? And how can we think about this? How can we codify it, systematize it? And then how can we use it compositionally? So, okay, I understand the idea of paradiddles as being part of a broader concept. What can I do with that? Well, the answer to that is they are presented as compositional tools. And that doesn't just mean a formal composer, but this might be somebody improvising, somebody looking to come up with their own interesting rhythmic line. So, broadly speaking, the book, I think, is based in 5 sections, and this includes an exploration of paradiddle-based stickings, drags, measured rolls, and then numerical applications like polyrhythms and the partition of numbers. And these are all concepts that I won't go into in great detail now because it's beside the point, but they were all concepts that drastically changed the way I thought about the rudiments and sticking patterns in general, drastically changed the way I thought about composition, because some of these ideas directly went on to influence the compositions I would go on to write, and directly influenced the way I thought about music and the snare drum generally. Now, as I've hinted at, I've always been an intellectually minded person. I enjoy academia. I enjoy the act of researching something or learning about something and writing about it. And I had never really encountered anything that took that approach to the snare drum. And that has certainly influenced me and my work and my publications since. If you look at something like the Snare Drum Virtuoso, after which this podcast is named, you will see, I think, very clear inspiration from Becker's work, from Rudimental Arithmetic. And the book closes with a collection of 8 etudes, which are Bob's original compositions, and demonstrate not only a masterful grasp of modern rudimental composition generally, but demonstrate how these concepts can be applied and how they can be used to produce genuinely musical phrases. So The top spot on my list, not that I intended to do these in any particular order, but certainly the top spot in terms of its influence and impact on me goes to Bob Becker's Rudimental Arithmetic. And I would certainly encourage anybody who has an interest in the analytical and the conceptual side of drumming and composition, especially as it applies to rhythm and the rudiments, to explore it. It really is a phenomenal work. So for my next book, I'm going to go with a collection of compositions, and this is one of the most famous in the world. It's called 14 Modern Contest Solos by John Pratt. And it's a very well-known book, and it includes a selection of very well-known pieces. And there's a few reasons that I've chosen this one as one of, I think, the seminal works of the instrument. Now, John Pratt was a really interesting figure. He was born in Seneca Falls, New York in 1931 and died only recently, a few years ago, in 2020, living to the ripe old age of 89. And he was many things in his life, almost all of them to do with playing a snare drum. He was a drum instructor at West Point. He was the founder or one of the founding members of the International Association of Traditional Drummers. He was in the Percussive Arts Society Hall of Fame and the World Drum Corps Hall of Fame. And he was a prolific composer of material, among various other things. And this piece in particular is a really interesting one. It was one of his first. It was published in 1959. And this is somewhat important because it straddles the line between the traditional repertoire that had come before and the more contemporary and modern repertoire that was to come, that I think Pratt was at the forefront of. Prior to Pratt, and prior to 14 Modern Contest Solos in particular, virtually all of the snare drumming repertoire had come from the National Association of Rudimental Drummers, which had come straight from the military tradition, and from Will Coxon. And these are all extremely traditional in form and function and structure and vocabulary. And in 1959, Pratt has started to progress from this traditional art form, and despite his love of the traditional rudiments, had started to drag rudimental drumming into a modern era, whether he intended to or not. The compositions that appear in 14 Modern Contest Solos, as I say, start to bridge this gap and pull rudimental drumming into the modern paradigm as it exists today. So there are some really famous pieces in here, and actually I think the best four, at least in terms of my very humble opinion, all occur next to each other. So we have Jolting John, Hodgepodge, Ginger Snap, and Stomping Through the Bar Line, all in sequence in the middle of the book, that I think represent, perhaps with the notable addition of Drum Corps on Parade, which opens the book. I think these represent four of the best of Pratt's work, at least in this era. He's done some great pieces since, but these are really interesting pieces because they were billed, as I said, back in the 1950s and the early 1960s, as championship level or contest level solos, and today they are not considered particularly advanced. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean that they're easy. They are in no way easy to perform as intended, but the compositional complexity and the use of vocabulary is certainly overshadowed by many pieces that have come since then, as I say, just in terms of their complexity. But nevertheless, they are certainly difficult enough in their own right to perform as intended. But what's really interesting to me about them is their position historically. I mean, Ginger Snap, even to this day, represents a real technical challenge to get it right. But the use of vocabulary has become almost synonymous with Pratt in this collection. I mean, the triplets in Ginger Snap are sometimes called Pratt triplets. That phrase that is definitive of or characteristic of that piece has become synonymous with Pratt. I remember I was having a lesson with Rick Dior, another phenomenal snare drum player and percussionist generally. And we were talking about ginger snap, and he said, ah, yes, the triplets, the Pratt triplets in ginger snap. And he knew exactly what I was struggling with, and he knew exactly how to help me fix it. But this was, at the time, revolutionary. Now, that's not to say that that vocabulary didn't exist before. It did, but Pratt was instrumental, pun intended, I suppose, instrumental in bringing this vocabulary out into a mainstream audience. This book was published to widespread acclaim, and it really helped publicize what was possible on a snare drum. So as a collection of the sort of archetypal pieces in the American tradition, I would certainly place Pratt's 14 Modern Contest Solos up there, right near the top. And for anybody wanting to get a kickstart into that world, to explore especially the American rudimental tradition, Pratt's 14 Modern Contest Solos is a great starting point. So the next piece of work I'm going to talk about is the only one on this list that is not strictly for the snare drum, but it is nevertheless extremely influential and very, very relevant, and certainly holds a special place in my own heart as well. And that book is Sticking Patterns by Gary Chaffee. This is a book that I encountered well before I encountered Becker's Rudimental Arithmetic, and almost had the same impact on me. It exposed me to ideas and concepts that I had never experienced before, and it presented work in such a way that I think was very reflective of what I would go on to produce later on. It really had an impact on me in many ways. Now, Gary Chaffee is an interesting figure. He is better known as a teacher rather than a player, which I'm not sure is fair, because he's a wonderful player. But he was chair of the percussion department at Berklee from 1972 to, I think, 1976. Yeah, 72 to 76. And in that time, he encountered students like Vinnie Colaiuta and Steve Smith, who have both gone on to become extremely successful and talented and accomplished players. And both Smith and Colaiuta look back with great fondness and respect for Chaffee. And it was around this time that he wrote, or was in the process of writing, Sticking Patterns. Now, on my copy here, the renewed copyright is shown as 1976. Now, I think I can remember reading an interview with Vinnie Colaiuta where he was talking about studying with Chaffee in the 1970s, and Chaffee was sort of demoing or trying out this material that would go into Sticking Patterns. So we're dealing with a period in the 1970s that culminated in its first major publication in 76. But as I say, I think he'd been working on the material for quite some while before that. Now, Sticking Patterns gives you some indication as to what to expect here. It is a book of sticking patterns, but as with rudimental arithmetic, it is a conceptual approach to sticking patterns. So it is not just cover to cover of sticking pattern 1, 2, 3, 503, 504. It is a demonstration of concept and how this concept can be applied. And one of the big breakthroughs, at least for me, when I encountered this, was in its treatment of accents and how everything we play and every sticking pattern and sticking concept we utilize is turned to the function of expressing accents. So in the opening sections of the book, which are almost preliminary, they're almost like a prologue, Chaffee explores accented single strokes and just makes sure that we as the reader are comfortable with the idea of voicing accent patterns and distinguishing them from taps. So there's a little bit of work on stick heights and stroke types and things like this to help us think about how we produce an accent and how we produce a tap. And many of the studies, many of the etudes in the opening sections are just single stroke based accent studies at different note values. And this is another really interesting point about Chaffee. There is absolutely no 4/4 16th note bias. Chaffee is absolutely comfortable to throw quintuplets and odd times at you straight from the beginning, because he doesn't want you to be thinking just in terms of 4/4. He wants you to be thinking in terms of sticking phrases and lengths. So when you are dealing with 5-note phrases, you have an etude in 15/16, and that 15/16 is just expressing 3 groups of 5/16 notes: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he presents this not as quintuplets, but as just straight groupings of 5, hence the time signature, 15/16. So again, that was really eye-opening to me as a treatment of time and rhythm and meter. So after the opening sections, we get into the real substance of the book, which is the sticking concepts themselves, which he labels groups A through E. And the idea of each group is it presents a progressive number of accents joined by double strokes. So group A, for instance, is a single accent followed by a certain number of double strokes. Group B is 2 accents, and then group C is 3 accents, and so on. And when you get into the multiple accents, like with paradiddles or double paradiddles, the single strokes at the beginning can either be accented or unaccented. So it gives you this vast swathe of possible sticking permutations with which to express accent figures. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail as to how the concept works now, but one of the key things this exposed me to was the idea that we can take a very simple sticking pattern, such as the very first one in this section that you encounter, so what he calls a 3A, a 3-note phrase in a group A configuration, which is just simply a right-handed accent followed by a left-handed double stroke, right, left, left, right, left, left, right, left, left, all evenly spaced. And because of this book, because of this treatment of it, I went and practiced, me being me, I went and practiced that 3-stroke phrase in every subdivision. So I began as simple 8th notes, which is of course polyrhythmic. Then I jumped up to triplets and then 16ths, quintuplets, sextuplets, septuplets, 32nd notes. And I made sure that I could play this 3-stroke sticking, right-hand accent, left, left, right, left, left, right, left, left, in essentially any subdivision, which then lent itself to virtually any time signature. And this became a major part of my playing vocabulary. And when I did the same thing with the 5-stroke phrase and the 7-stroke phrase, and Chaffee presents dozens of studies that let you practice this material, I suddenly found that my drum kit playing had expanded greatly. My soloing repertoire and the way I conceptualized what I was playing was just fundamentally changed, irreversibly so. And again, when you look at my more recent work on the snare drum, these sticking patterns and the stickings-based approach, very similar to Becker's work, are apparent. Creating phrases with 3s and 5s and 7s and using the ready-made stickings that Chaffee demonstrated to fill the phrase. This was something that has directly influenced my compositional work as well as my playing on the drum kit. So I'm including this one. Yes, it's not strictly a work on the snare drum specifically, but because of the way it treats sticking, its conceptual approach to timing, its conceptual approach to rhythm, and its conceptual approach to sticking as general concept, it's right up there with Becker's Rudimental Arithmetic as a seminal work of pedagogy that has had profound and lasting impacts on myself and I think many other drummers who have read it. So Gary Chaffee's Sticking Patterns, there are many books, incidentally, in Chaffee's Patterns series, and all of them are worth reading, especially his rhythm and meter patterns. But for me, Sticking Patterns is the masterpiece. It's his magnum opus, I think, that ties together all these wonderful ideas in a way that is profoundly clever and profoundly usable for those that go on to practice it and apply it. So following on from Chaffee, we're going to depart America briefly and explore the work of Jacques Delacluse, especially his book 12 Etudes, or 12 Etudes for the Snare Drum. This is a really seminal piece released in 1964, and it's a collection of course, 12 studies for snare drum, and shares the renown and fame of Pratt's 14 modern contest solos, but just in a different field, in a different area. So Jacques Delacluse was a French musician born in 1933, And he was the son of a musician as well. His father, the incredibly named Ulysses de Lecluse, was himself a clarinetist and a musical pedagogue. And Jacques de Lecluse himself, his first instrument was the piano, where he studied at the Conservatoire de Paris. And he took up percussion a little bit later on, and he studied at both the Orchestre de Paris and the Conservatoire de Paris in timpani and piano across other percussion disciplines as well. And it's his snare drum work that I'm interested in here. Now, Deux Etudes is seminal specifically within the orchestral field. It has become commonplace among orchestral percussionists studying the discipline. And it is really representative of that style of music and is also this sort of archetype of the orchestral collection. It has certainly gone on to inspire similar composers. There's a lot of parallel, I think, with Anthony Cerrone and Mitchell Peters across the pond with Deux Etudes, and there's a similar sort of rhythmic approach. But I'll come to that anyway. So Deux Etudes, of course, contains 12 studies for the snare drum. And the first thing you notice, I'm holding my copy here in front of me. The first thing you notice is the absolute lack of sticking. There is no sticking in any of the Deux Etudes. And this really bothered me at first, because when I first encountered this book, I was coming very much from a rudimental tradition where I liked to go through it and spot the rudiments and see how the particular sticking patterns had been employed. You know, when you consider the previous 3 collections I've just talked about, which are all based on the analysis of sticking patterns and vocabulary, and especially their role in compositional systems, compositional processes, to encounter these very famous and very difficult pieces of repertoire with no sticking whatsoever was quite jarring. And I encountered this collection around the same time that I encountered Bob Becker's Rudimental Arithmetic, back when I was just beginning my first Arts Council funded project and my first forays into the snare drum as a solo instrument. And I was fortunate enough to study with a percussionist over in America called Rob Knopper. And Rob was, at the time, I'm not sure if he still is, but he was at the time the snare drummer, or one of the snare drummers, or principal snare drummer at the New York Metropolitan Orchestra. And he had made a name for himself by producing very high quality recordings of very high quality performances of himself playing all 12 of de Lecluse's Deux Etudes. And throughout his work for those productions, he had visited France and visited Jacques himself while he was still alive. He sadly died in 2015. Rob had visited him and talked to him and I don't want to say had lessons with him, because Jacques was retired by that stage, but had certainly been able to talk to him firsthand and gain many valuable insights into de Lecluse's work. So when I was fortunate enough to study with Rob Knopper, one of the things I asked him about was de Lecluse's work. Now, Rob, of course, was very much entrenched in the orchestral tradition, and he was able to sort of deftly guide me through the conceptual quagmire that I was facing with these etudes. And the real big takeaway, I think, that I took from those sessions, and now keep with me as I'm looking at my copy of Deux Etudes here, is how de Lecluse placed the rhythmic phrasing above the vocabulary and the sticking used to produce it. So this was a reversal of what I was used to. And it was a very conscious decision for Jacques de Lecluse to exclude or to omit any sticking, because he didn't want the student to fascinate on the sticking. He wanted the student to focus on the sound and to use their best approach to produce that sound. Frankly, I don't think he cared about sticking at all. I don't think he cared whether you played a collection of 4 strokes as singles, doubles, paradiddles, or anything else. What he cared about is what those 4 strokes sounded like, both in isolation and in context of the larger piece. So it was very much left up to the performer to work out for themselves not the correct sticking, but the most appropriate sticking for what they were trying to do. And Rob described to me Jack's approach of how these were to be treated like structures or canvases, and it was up to the student, up to the performer, to paint the picture using this as the basis. He didn't want people to just regurgitate precisely what he'd written on the page. He wanted the performer to make it their own, which is again why the sticking was completely omitted. Now, I found that fascinating. I found that really interesting, and it certainly helped me to understand the approach a little bit. Now, the vocabulary was a challenge as well. Now, interestingly, I'm looking at Etude 1 on the first page of the collection, and this is a piece in 6/8, and in the beginning of the fourth measure is one of Pratt's triplets, what I talked about from Ginger Snap earlier. Now, of course, in 6/8, it's not a triplet, but it's the same fundamental rhythm. And again, this was written in, or at least published in 1964, so this was produced around about the same time as Pratt's 14 Modern Contest Solos. And again, it fulfilled a similar function when it was released in that it brought to a much wider audience the apparently opaque vocabulary and concepts and repertoire of the orchestral tradition of snare drumming. Now, when I asked Rob about the vocabulary, the first thing he said to me was, well, I said to him, I'm struggling to get a grasp of what I'm seeing. I can play the figures, but I'm not sure what I'm hearing. And he said to me, the first thing he asked was, have you ever played in an orchestra? And I said, no. So he said, well, then you are not familiar with the pieces that he is referencing. And of course, me not having an orchestral background, I'm not familiar with orchestral repertoire, especially not from the musician's perspective. A lot of the phrases, a lot of the figures, and a lot of the passages in Delacluze's work reference, either directly or indirectly, famous passages and famous pieces from the orchestral tradition. So to orchestral musicians and orchestral students, especially percussionists, a lot of Delacluze's phrases will make much more sense. To me, coming into that world from the outside, I would never have known that. And I would have, I think, struggled around, fluffing around in the darkness, trying to get a handhold of what was going on here if I hadn't been given that insight. So the reason I've included Delacluze here today is because I think it is, I keep using the word, but it is seminal in the orchestral tradition for a drummer looking to begin their journey into snare drum playing that is not rudimental in a strict sense. This is a really great starting point. It is famous, it is well renowned, it is well known. It's commonly used by orchestral percussion students in their training. You'll find it on reading lists at college, audition lists, and all sorts of things. It features a really high degree of technical touch to produce the rolls, and some of the dynamic markings requires a real deftness of touch, which is why many orchestral students study it. And as I say, for the student looking to begin their journey, or for any percussionist or any drummer or musician looking to begin their journey exploring the orchestral tradition, Jacques Delacluze's Deux Etudes is probably the perfect starting point. Now, there's two more pieces of work that I want to discuss today. And the first of those I'm just going to discuss very briefly. I touched on it last time, and it's another piece by Bob Becker, but this time it is one of his major compositions. This is a piece called Mudra. And it is the only piece of work in this list today that is specifically a singular composition rather than a collection or a piece of pedagogy. And I think, to me, it represents the finest example of all of the aspects that I've been talking about and all of the things that I study and I'm interested in as an artist, all culminating together into this magnum opus piece of work that is a performance. So Mudra is a piece of music that's round about 13 or 14 minutes long. And it's almost like a concerto for the snare drum. The snare drum is front and center and features all of the concepts that Bob would later write about in rudimental arithmetic. It features all of these ideas at play. It features specific sticking patterns used in conjunction with each other to produce accent figures. It features permutation studies, it features partition of numbers, it features rhythmic densities, and all of these ideas that he would later codify in his pedagogical works as musical devices that occur organically. So you're not listening to it as a music fan going, oh, there's this device and there's this device. It all flows together seamlessly. But when you analyze it from a compositional perspective, you can certainly hear these ideas at play. Now, mudra, of course, features the snare drum front and center, but it's also accompanied by a swathe of pitched and unpitched percussion. There are toned bells. There are keyboard percussion. I'm not sure whether they're always marimba or sometimes marimba, or can be substituted for vibraphone or xylophone or whatnot, but there's I think at least 3 pitched percussion parts that are played on keyboard percussion. There's a taiko in there, and they all synchronize together in such a mesmerizing way. And the part on the snare drum is also devilishly challenging, fast, complex, and requires a very high degree of skill to execute it. And I think I talked about this in my previous episode about mastery. There is, to my knowledge, one video of Bob Becker himself performing mudra, and it is just wonderful. His grasp of the instrument, the expression of the performance, the realization of the piece of music as a whole is just brilliant. So that, to me, if you were to ask me to name one singular piece of work that represented, if you like, the ultimate of what the snare drum can do as a musical instrument, yes, it's not a solo piece, but I don't think that matters. I think it is really wonderful. I think it's a brilliant piece, and I think it is one of the most important snare drum pieces ever written. Yes, it's accompanied, but the way the snare drum carries everything and sits center stage is just an absolute masterclass in both the compositional and the performance aspects of the snare drum. Now, before I finish with my final book, there are, of course, many pieces of work that I have excluded, and I've had to exclude them for the sake of brevity and to make an episode of a reasonable length. I could have talked about America's Nard drum solos, the collection of 150 rudimental solos that almost define the American rudimental tradition. I could have talked about any other of Pratt's works, especially the Black Book, Rudimental Solos for Advanced Drummers. I could have talked about any of Will Coxon's pieces, or any of Will Coxon's works. I've talked about Rolling in Rhythm earlier. I could have talked about Rhythmania, for example, as a singular piece. Or I could have talked about The All-American Drummer, Will Coxon's collection of 150 solos. I could have talked about Will Coxon's modern rudimental swing solos. And there are various other pedagogical works I could have talked about as well. Perhaps the most notable omission, surprisingly, perhaps for many people, is the Moeller book. Now, Moeller is a figure that I am going to talk about on another episode. And the reason I have not included Moeller's book in this episode talking about seminal works is because I don't actually think his book is particularly well known. I don't think his book does him justice as the man he was. I don't think it does his work justice, and I don't think his book is well known enough for it to count as a seminal piece of work. Now, he absolutely is. He, as a pedagogue himself, is extremely influential, although, as I shall argue in a future episode, probably for the wrong reasons. But that's a rabbit warren I don't want to fall down right now. But the Moeller book is probably the most noticeable absence from this book. From this list. And there are many others, pedagogical and compositional. I did want to talk about Robert Goutt's collections of ordonnance de tambour, which demonstrate the French tradition in all its glory, but I just simply don't have the time. I think that needs an episode all to itself. So the book I am going to finish with today bridges the gap between the French and the American traditions, and it is volume 1 of Joe Tompkins' French-American Rudimental Solos collection. Now, I think to date, to the best of my knowledge, there are currently 4 volumes in this collection. I've got in front of me Volume 1, called simply 9 French-American Rudimental Solos, Volume 1, published in 2007. Now, last time I spoke to Joe, I'm happy to call him a colleague and perhaps even a friend who's been good enough to guide me in my own journey. We've worked together on a number of occasions on things relating to the snare drum. And he was one of my main points of contact in my first Arts Council project, and one of the people who was very gracious with his time, willing to share a lot of advice with me and talk to me about many of the things I was studying. Now, Joe is, as I say, at least last I spoke to him, was head of percussion at Rutgers Mason Goss University in New York, and plays orchestrally and composes, and is all around a really fantastic snare drummer and composer. And the reason I've decided to go with this book and this collection in particular is the way in which it expertly weaves together two disparate traditions into something that sounds absolutely natural and organic. Now, I'm just going to read here a few paragraphs from an email conversation I had with Joe back in January 2021, when I was specifically asking him about his compositional approach. I'd just come into possession of this book, 9 French-American Solos, Volume 1, and like with De La Cluse, I just didn't really understand it. So I contacted the man himself, and he was very gracious enough to tell me about it. So in reading these next two paragraphs, I hope to share some of that insight into how he has gone about in constructing and composing these solos. So these are Joe's words. Generally, my compositional approach is built around combinations of American and French concepts with a sense of style probably more closely tied to jazz, in that each piece usually has a sense of swing or a lilt and develops from my own improvisations. When I think of American drumming traditions, I place jazz drummers at the top. Rudimental drumming is wonderful for technique, but I find the expression of jazz drumming to be most captivating. The spontaneity and energy of the great jazz drummers has, I hope, influenced my writing. Each piece has unique source material, however, and not all are jazz influenced. I will say that much can be lost when pencil meets paper, and the challenge is to compose without distilling the ideas down to the point of a mundane exercise. Stylistically, the French and American traditions work well together, in my opinion, because they are so different. The French repertoire, passed down for generations through an oral tradition for centuries, is far more intricate, le coup de charge being one example, than the American repertoire. There are a variety of reasons for this, many being hypothetical. Function in a military setting limited the complexity of British drumming traditions, and this was inherited in the American setting. Swiss influences on the French are of great influence, and there are other possible explanations for the vastly different trajectories of these two styles. Compositionally, I find that the less familiar French concepts provide tension in my music, and, generally, American rudimental concepts provide release. This is an oversimplification, of course, but generally holds. Now, I was fortunate enough to have many such conversations with Joe, both face-to-face, or at least insofar as Zoom would allow, and over email in a similar style to that. And it really helped me understand and tie together in my own mind how these conceptual approaches can come together and work in harmony. And I don't really think another piece of work or a collection of work like this exists, or at least I don't think it did when Volume 1 was published back in 2007. When you look on something like YouTube and you search for Joe Tompkins, you find many students performing pieces from these collections. They are very far-reaching, and they are often used in the same way as De La Cluse's pieces. They're used as audition pieces, they're used as sources for studying both technique and vocabulary, as well as compositional devices. And I think they're often more important than people realize because of the work they've done in uniting two very disparate traditions. It's far too deep and complex to adequately describe now, but there are massive differences between the French and the American traditions that are far more than just skin deep. The entire approach to rhythm, the entire approach to vocabulary, the entire approach to timing is different. And I think Joe recognizes this. And over the course of his 4 collections, produces pieces that in some senses are quite obscure because of the sources of the vocabulary, but in other senses are really quite ahead of their time in how they deftly weave together these 2 sources, these 2 traditions. So while I don't think maybe yet these 4 volumes have quite the same level of fame and reach as someone like Pratt's work, I think these are equally important in their own right because of, as I say, the melding together of 2 traditions in a way that really hasn't been done before. So for me, this is probably the least well-known collection on this list, if you like, but in fact one of the most important because of the work it's doing facing forward in uniting drumming traditions from across the world. So these pieces, they are very difficult, they're very complex, and they are almost a perfect middle ground between the work of Pratt and the work of Delacluse. And they are some of the most refined and clever compositions that I have seen. So for somebody looking for a challenge, looking for something new to explore that will broaden their horizons, these are really fantastic examples of really important pieces of work that I think don't yet have enough attention. They've not got enough credit for what they've achieved. And I really hope these 4 volumes go on to achieve that, because I think they are that important. Now, as I've said, there are many things I have overlooked. I've not talked about any of Mitchell Peters' work or Anthony Cirone's work, these really famous and well-known collections, and I can't fit them all into a single episode. So many of these famous pieces of work I will return to in later episodes. But I hope for now the things I've talked about today will give you some inspiration and ideas of things you can go out and explore, and that will hopefully give you the same joy and challenge of study as they did with me. So thank you very much for listening. As I've said, if you've enjoyed what I've talked about today, come and say hello at my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk. Now, to play us out, I'm going to play one of the pieces I've already discussed today, and this is John Pratt's Ginger Snap. This demonstrates those tricky Pratt triplets. You'll hear them in there. I'll talk about them in greater detail another day. But thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. I'll see you on the next episode of the Snare Drum Virtuoso, and let's enjoy to close John Pratt's Ginger Snap. Thank you very much.